Today we'll be going over the top 5 gunslingers of the Wild West. The Wild West had thinly spread law enforcement, so oftentimes men carried guns to protect themselves. A gunslinger could be from any occupation, outlaws, lawmen, and anything in between, but it was simply a person that had gained a reputation of being dangerous with a gun. Number 5 on our list today is Harry Alonzo Longabog, or the Sundance Kid. Harry, as he was first known as, left home when he was 15 years old and ended up in the town of Sundance, where he got caught for stealing a horse. This led to him being imprisoned for the only time in his life. After getting released, he took the town's name as his own nickname and so became known as the Sundance Kid. He then went to Wyoming and began his outlaw career. He was implicated in a train robbery before he joined up with an outlaw gang called the Wild Bunch and started working with another outlaw, Butch Cassidy. The Sundance Kid and Butch Cassidy started working together to steal horses, hold up banks, and rob trains. The Wild Bunch was probably the most successful band of train robbers in American history. The Sundance Kid was said to be the best shot and the fastest gunslinger of the Wild Bunch gang, and so this made the Sundance Kid a very wanted man. In order to evade the law, the Sundance Kid had to keep moving around to different states. The Sundance Kid eventually ended up running to New York with his girlfriend and Butch Cassidy, and then moved again to South America, where they owned and ran a ranch in Argentina for a little bit. The Sundance Kid and Butch Cassidy, though, soon returned to an outlaw lifestyle. Drifting around South America, they robbed banks, trains, and mining stations. They had to move again to Bolivia because the Pinkerton Detective Agency was closing in on them. The details of the Sundance Kid's death remain a mystery even to this day, and there are multiple different stories about his fate. The first is that the Sundance Kid and Butch Cassidy were trapped by a group of mounted soldiers in Bolivia, and both ended up dead. The second story says that both bandits were killed during a bank robbery in Uruguay. And the third and final tale have the Sundance Kid, either alone or with Butch Cassidy, returning to the United States and drifting about under different aliases. During his time with the Wild Bunch, it is believed that the Sundance Kid never took a life. Number 4 on our list is Wild Bill Hickok. Bill was born in Illinois and left home when he was 17 years old to go to Kansas and join an anti-slavery army. Bill had already been skilled with a gun in his youth, and so served as a bodyguard for a general. Bill had a reputation for being fair and courageous, and he earned a position as a constable in Kansas. He then started work as a driver for the Pony Express, and at this point an encounter happened that would add to Bill's lore. One day, Bill came across a bear blocking a road. Bill shot the bear, but it only angered the bear, and a struggle ensued, during which Bill used a knife to finish the bear off, but not before he was almost crushed to death. He was bedridden for several months after this bear incident, before he moved to Nebraska to continue working for the Pony Express, which is what became known as the McClanney's Massacre happened. Supposedly, Bill was guiding some Union cavalry through southern Nebraska, and Bill decided to stop to visit a friend. Upon arriving, Bill learned that a Confederate gang was pursuing him. Almost immediately, the Confederates were upon them and invaded the cabin. Bill acted the fastest and shot the leader of the gang from 75 yards away, and then quickly shot 5 members of the gang and knocked out another 3 members before he was overwhelmed and thrown down on the bed, where he pulled out his knife and bested the rest of the gang members in hand-to-hand combat. These events became popularized in the dime novels of the time and added to his reputation as being one of the heroes of the West. However, historians now believe the story to be completely different than what was originally told, and believe it happened not at a cabin, but at the Pony Express station, and believe that it may have had to do with a man demanding payments be made, which turned into a gunfight where several other people other than Bill helped to dispatch the men. But however the McClanney's Massacre happened, Bill was charged with murder, but was found not guilty because it was believed that he had acted in self-defense. During the Civil War, Bill had worked as a spy, a scout, and a sharpshooter, and after the war, Bill continued his adventures and was on a thin line between good and bad. At one point, another skilled gunfighter had won a watch from Bill in a poker game and was flaunting it before Bill unalived him. Bill was arrested yet again for murder and again wasn't charged with anything. This added a lot to his reputation of being a gunslinger, and Bill started exaggerating to a journalist that he had unalived 100 men. Bill went on to become a sheriff and ended up unaliving several more men in shootouts. Then he took over as the marshal, where yet again he unalived several more men in shootouts, including accidentally pulling the trigger on his own deputy marshal, which ended up leading to Bill's dismissal. Bill was one of the few people of the time to participate in actual, on-the-street, Western quick-draw battles. Later on in Bill's life, he worked as a peace officer in South Dakota and mostly relied on his reputation as a gunslinger as his eyesight was starting to fail, so his gun skills were diminished. As a lawman, Bill was expected to maintain order in some of the roughest parts of the Old West. Because Bill had such a large reputation, he seemed to attract trouble and violence, and was a constant presence in the saloons where most of the trouble started. Bill met his end in the middle of a poker match by getting shot in the back of the head by a man who may have been hired to dispatch him. The cards Bill had been holding was a pair of black aces, a pair of black eights, plus an unknown fifth card, which became known as the dead man's hand. Next on our list is Tom Horn. Very little is known about Tom's early years. He was born in Missouri, and supposedly he was good at hunting and marksmanship at an early age. At age 14, he left home to move to Santa Fe, where Tom started work as a stagecoach driver and started learning how to speak Spanish. He then started to manage and run wagon trains that served the Army. He was involved in several Army battles involving Apaches, but Tom didn't get to see much of the action. However, according to Tom, he played more of a central role, claiming he knew the Apache language and had lived among them. He also insisted that at one point he was translator and was giving orders to Army officers. The reality of the situation was probably more that his role was to only translate and not speak unless told to. After this, he became involved in a feud between two ranchers. Tom had later said that he served as the deputy sheriff and that he was the mediator between the two sides. However, there has been no actual evidence to support that, and Tom was known to be a bit of an embellisher. It has been speculated that Tom may have been responsible for his first unaliving this time, as there was a man who had passed but no one was attached to the incident. And Tom later said that he had taken his first man when he was 26 years old, which would have been the age he was when this ranching feud occurred. Tom then worked for the Pinkerton Detective Agency, who had hired him to track down and arrest outlaws to help prevent cattle rustling, but he ended up leaving the agency after 4 years to work as an independent detective and as a gun for hire. His gunslinger skills were in demand from the large cattlemen who wanted all of the homesteaders off the land to make more room for grazing cattle. So Tom would send threatening letters to the homesteaders and investigate them for cattle rustling, and if they didn't get the hint and didn't leave, they were marked as a troublemaker and were taken care of the old-fashioned way. Tom often shot from 200 yards away, so most of his victims literally never knew what hit them. Tom made quite a bit of money off of this work and preferred to work alone. The beginning of the end started for Tom when there was a feud between two rancher families in Wyoming. A 14-year-old boy was mistaken for his father and was targeted and unalived. The deputy sheriff suspected Tom, probably for obvious reasons, and got Tom drunk. Tom, who seemed to have a high opinion of himself, bragged about the incident to the deputy sheriff. The deputy sheriff took this as a confession and arrested Tom. Tom was eventually found guilty for the death of the 14-year-old and met his end by being strung up in Wyoming. though a lot of the evidence was unclear, and it is widely debated if Tom was actually guilty or not for the passing of the 14-year-old, as the jury seemed to convict him solely on the basis of his drunken confession. The jury also seemed to dismiss testimonies of credible witnesses who claimed that Tom couldn't have committed the crime. Regardless if he was responsible for the passing of this boy or not, he was still a brutal man, and it is thought that in his 46 years, he was responsible for as many as 50 other unalivings. Most of the information that we know of Tom comes from his autobiography, which he wrote while awaiting his date with the hangman, and wanted to prove that he was innocent and a Wild West hero. And there is evidence that Tom's autobiography was edited by another person before it was published. This means that very little is known for sure about Tom's life, but this just adds to the mystery that was Tom Horn. His last words were, "That's the sickest looking lot of damned sheriffs I ever saw." Number 2 on our list is none other than Wyatt Earp, who was a famous lawman and earned his reputation as one of the best and the toughest gunslingers in the Wild West. Wyatt was born in Illinois and had 7 siblings, some of whom would later play a large role in Wyatt's life. Wyatt eventually moved to Missouri, got married, and then got elected the local constable. However, within a year of being married, his wife unfortunately passed from typhoid, and this caused a lot of unrest in Wyatt's life. He then started having multiple run-ins with the law, including facing allegations of embezzlement, stealing horses, and he got arrested for various offenses, most of which dealt with brothels. He had moved around a lot during this time, all over the Old West, where he continued to work in brothels, most likely as a bouncer, and continued to get arrested for things. Later, he had helped a police officer track down a wagon thief and seemed to turn his life around for a little bit. He ended up working as a police officer in a couple of towns before becoming an assistant marshal. He was known at this time as both a lawman and a gambler. He continued to move around to places like the New Mexico Territory, California, and eventually ended up in Tombstone, Arizona, where his brother was a town marshal. Wyatt became a guard in a saloon, and together with some of his brothers, they became the law and order in Tombstone. In the town of Tombstone, there was a local outlaw gang that initially started out as just a small nuisance by rustling cattle. However, the feud between this outlaw gang and Wyatt and his brothers grew as both groups struggled to control the city of Tombstone. This eventually led to the legendary gunfight at the OK Corral. One morning, 2 men from the outlaw gang came into Tombstone for supplies and ran into Wyatt, some of Wyatt's brothers, and another gunslinger, Doc Holliday. Several violent run-ins between the two sides occurred. Over the next 24 hours, more fighting happened, and some other men from the outlaw gang rode into town to join in on the fight. Later that day, the two sides were behind the OK Corral and started the famous gunfight. Wyatt's brothers ordered the outlaws to give up their guns, but instead shots were fired, although it's unclear who pulled the trigger first. This shootout lasted about 30 seconds, and around 30 shots were fired in that time. Doc Holliday and Wyatt's 2 brothers were wounded, but survived. 3 of the outlaws didn't make it, but the leader of the gang and another member escaped. Wyatt wasn't even injured in this fight. Later, Wyatt's brother was then shot and seriously wounded by unknown attackers, and another one of Wyatt's brothers was shot while playing billiards. Wyatt had been appointed Deputy U.S. Marshal and had organized a posse to go after the suspects in what would be known as the Vendetta Ride. Wyatt dispatched at least 2 of the men who were suspected for the crime. However, the extra unalivings damaged his reputation in Tombstone, and Wyatt was then accused of murder. In order to escape the law, he fled to Colorado and eventually to California, where he laid low and supported himself by gambling. Later in his life, Wyatt wrote an autobiography, though many of the claims that he made in this were exaggerated or untrue. He portrayed himself as a fearless lawman. He had also consulted on Hollywood westerns and had gotten to know various actors and actresses. He passed away at the ripe old age of 80, and his funeral was attended by several celebrities. Number 1 on our list today is Jim Miller, who was one of the worst and most violent gunslingers that the Wild West saw. Jim's bloody deeds are said to have started when he was 8 years old, when Jim's grandparents were found unalived in their home. Jim was arrested, but never persecuted for the crime, as it could never be proven that he committed this crime. Getting arrested and then getting freed soon became the story of his life. Later in his life, his brother-in-law was shot by a shotgun while he was in bed. Jim was soon arrested for the incident, as he had openly hated the man. Jim would have been sentenced to life in prison, except he was freed on a technicality. After this, Jim joined up with an outlaw gang where he robbed trains and stagecoaches and took lives in the process. He then started a career as an assassin and said that he would unalive anyone for money. As an assassin, he earned the reputation of getting the job done quickly and efficiently, usually using a shotgun ambush at night. Jim wasn't a quick-draw gunfighter, but was quick to use a gun when it suited him. In addition to being a hitman, Jim was known to have unalived several men in saloons. Surprisingly, Jim was a mild-mannered man who never cursed, drank, or smoked. He was usually very well dressed and was often known to read the Bible and attend church with his wife and 4 children. Jim's outward appearance may have been what caused a sheriff in Texas to hire him on as a deputy sheriff. The sheriff didn't ask Jim too many questions about his past, because in those days it was considered rude to do so. This would end up being a fatal mistake for the sheriff, as Jim was a wolf in sheep's clothing. Jim moved his whole family down to Texas so Jim could do deputy sheriff work. He continued to attend church and did seem to be a very honorable man. However, at the same time that Jim took the position as deputy sheriff, cattle rustling and horse theft increased all around the area. Jim spent a lot of his time pursuing the thieves, but never captured any of them. This raised suspicions, so the sheriff eventually confronted Jim, but Jim only laughed off the accusations. Jim was supported by members of his church, and there was no evidence, so the sheriff had to allow Jim to continue playing the role of deputy sheriff. Jim then shot a prisoner that was trying to escape. The sheriff investigated the situation and suspected that the prisoner was shot because the man knew where Jim had hidden a pair of stolen mules. The sheriff was actually able to locate the stolen mules and immediately fired Jim. This would be the beginning of a very deadly feud that would last several years. In the next election, Jim tried to run for sheriff but lost, but did end up getting appointed as the marshal of the town. Jim surrounded himself with fellow gunmen and hired his own deputy. When the sheriff got called away for business, Jim took this opportunity and planned to unalive the sheriff when he came back from business. However, this plan was overheard by a man who then sent a warning to the sheriff. The sheriff came back into town with a bunch of Texas Rangers who arrested Jim. However, before the case could be heard, the witness who overheard the plans was shot by one of Jim's henchmen. Without a witness, the state had to release Jim. Jim did lose his job as marshal, though. After this, rumors began to circulate around town that the sheriff shouldn't be sheriff anymore because people began to think he was incompetent. This obviously caused the sheriff to feel a lot of resentment towards Jim. When the sheriff and Jim encountered each other on the street, the sheriff yelled at him that he was a cattle rustler and a murderer and opened fire on Jim, striking him several times. As soon as Jim slumped over, the sheriff turned and walked away, without checking to make sure that he was actually dead. This would be yet another mistake that the sheriff made because, surprisingly, Jim survived. Jim always wore a heavy frock coat no matter how hot. This was to hide a metal breastplate that he always wore under his coat. Jim openly made many threats against the sheriff, and this eventually resulted in another encounter between the two, where the sheriff sent 2 shots into Jim's right arm and another couple of shots into Jim's chest, as the sheriff wasn't aware of Jim's hidden breastplate. Seeing that Jim was still standing after multiple shots to the chest, the sheriff fled. The sheriff then had charges of attempted murder filed against him by none other than John Wesley Hardin, who was a known killer who had turned attorney. The sheriff was eventually released, which caused Jim to get extremely angry, and once again, Jim planned the death of the sheriff. This time, Jim was able to finally surprise the sheriff while he was playing cards in the saloon and finished him off. Jim, once again, was arrested for murder, but was able to avoid jail. He moved and opened a saloon where he openly boasted about the many crimes that he had committed, and anyone who had opposed him continued to mysteriously disappear. He went back to assassin jobs and was involved in several different cattleman feuds where he took the lives of quite a few people. Jim was again arrested for yet another murder, but got released on bail. Yet again, all of the witnesses and persecutors were unalived, and Jim was released again for lack of evidence and witnesses. Jim's assassin skills were wanted again to take care of a retired deputy marshal. Jim had gotten away with so much in his life that he got too confident, and this time his escape was sloppy. He was soon found by the law, though the evidence still wasn't solid. Jim may have gotten away yet again, but it was well known that Jim had unalived the man and that he had gotten away with many previous crimes. This caused a mob of about 50 men to storm the jail and necktie Jim. Allegedly, before he was sent swinging, Jim admitted to unaliving 51 men. His last words were, "Let her rip." There are more gunslingers than what is just on this list, but I didn't want to cover people who I've already talked about in a previous video. I will put a link to that video in the description below. Who is your favorite Wild West gunslinger? It doesn't have to be anyone on this list. Let me know in the comments section. And remember to hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already.